I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. First off, to continue supporting the industry, there are 3 suppliers I'd like to mention this week. Fertile Fibre, who are still delivering bags of compost, including peat-free, organic and vegan varieties, and you can order directly from them at fertilefibre.com. Also, if you'd like to get hold of some fertiliser for your plants, and if your seedlings are like mine and seem to be doubling by the day, you'll need to be up in your plant feeding game soon, so you should check out Natural Grower, who are still delivering. Their products are also vegan, organic and friendly to all sorts of wildlife, including my personal favourites, earthworms. You can also order direct from them at naturalgrower.co.uk. And finally, I'd like to mention gardentopsoildirect.co.uk, who are still delivering bulk bags of topsoil composts, including organic composts and soils for green roofs and turf dressing products, amongst other things, which may be particularly useful if you have a larger project on the go or if you're a horticultural professional. So do go and check them out too and show your support for these amazing companies who are striving to keep going and to get products out to customers at this time. So on to the episode. I'm speaking to Peter Marren, author of Chasing the Ghost, My Search for All the Wildflowers of Britain. Peter travelled the length and breadth of Britain to track down those native species he'd never seen growing in the wild. But as Peter mentions, like all the best heroes' journeys, the path must be littered with challenges, disappointments, interesting characters, in this case both plants and people, and the drama of the journey travelled surpasses the quest. This episode is perfect for those of us lucky enough to still have access to nature, and my hope is that by the end of it, at least 1 or 2 of you will have a new hobby/obsession. Could you please explain the quest that you embarked upon and the one that you document in Chasing the Ghost?
Yeah, I decided to turn it into a kind of journey in search of plants because it gave me a frame in which to hang a lot of things I wanted to write about wildflowers. I think they're, as a subject, compared with birds and animals, they have a very low profile nowadays. And I wanted to say something about the pleasures of hunting for wildflowers, because it really is a hunt sometimes. The friendships you make on the way, the battles against British weather, the strange places you end up in. And I wanted to put all these things into a narrative. So the obvious way of doing it was a kind of quest in search of something that is really difficult to find. And so I made it the last 50 wildflowers I've never seen, because in a whole lifetime I've been all around Britain and I've just by chance seen most of the wildflowers. But these 50 incredibly elusive ones that had passed me by, I thought I'd turn all that into a journey and try and do it in a single year. So it meant going round Britain about 3 times in search of plants, and that was the adventure.
I know this is a bit of a contentious issue, but how many species of native wildflower are there in Britain?
Well, it's about 1,200. It's a bit fuzzy at the edges because it's not clear which plants are native and which have just been here a long time but were originally introduced by us. So, something like the field poppy in a cornfield, it's been here about 2,000 years, but it probably isn't strictly native. You see what I mean?
Yes.
There's this large grey area. It depends how many critical species one includes, because the dandelion can be divided up into about 200 different dandelions. The only trouble is there's only about 20 people in the country that could identify them. So is a dandelion one species or 200 species? Well, I'm saying it's one species. So anyway, about 1,200, which is quite a lot.
Yeah. So the people that you met in your book, were they friends that you had made purely through plants?
About half of them were friends and acquaintances, and half of them were people I met on the journey. We're all members of the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and it's almost like a club, really. Botanists are very nice, helpful people, and they like showing people their favourite plants. And I wanted to get that into the book because it gives it a conversation. If you just meet a plant in the wild, that's just you and the plant, well, all you've got is biology. But if you're with an acquaintance, a friend that loves that plant, they can explain why they love it, what is special about it for them. You see what I mean? So it becomes one person's love for a flower, and it's all rooted in their own experience, and it says something about the flower as well, and it gives me, as a journalist, something to hang on to.
So in your opinion, is there a common motivation for people who do track down rare plants?
Well, I don't think many people do. A lot of people photograph flowers, but they don't necessarily want to track down every single one. I think that's quite an unusual aim. It's different with birds. A lot of people want to track down as many birds as possible, but I don't know many plant twitchers as such. I mean, I was only twitching them as a means to an end. But the one group that people do like to see all the plants is the wild orchids. There's about 50 different kinds in Britain, and some of them are very hard to track down, so it's a challenge. And they're all very beautiful and interesting. And there's something special about orchids. You know, they're halfway to becoming an animal, I think. So that's a very popular group. But otherwise, it just tends to be people that are very keen on wildflowers, and that's quite a limited number of people nowadays.
Is it an art that's dying?
I don't know about dying. As an academic subject, it's dying. Botany is no longer taught at British universities as a subject. There is botanical sciences at Cambridge, but mostly it's now biological sciences in which plants just play a very small part. And compared to the number of people that are interested in birds or bats or fishes in Britain, the number of people that are interested in plants is very, very, much, much smaller by a factor of about 100. It was quite different about 100 years ago when botany was, much more exciting, and British botanists going all over the world and bringing back wonderful rhododendrons and other plants for botanic gardens. Some of that's disappeared. I think it's the low profile of plants in the media on television, compared with lions roaring around the Serengeti or beautiful birds. Plants are relatively static. And they're weather dependent, and quite possibly the presenters don't know much about plants either. So they tend to get a very low profile, and what profile they do get tends to be about gardening rather than about wildflowers.
Yes, very true. So, you touched on the orchids actually, and I don't know whether this is the case, but what was your best, or should I say maybe your most triumphant or special find?
The ones I was most pleased with, I suppose, was there's a rare alpine called Diapensia. It's so rare it doesn't even have an English name. And it's incredibly remote. It's very hard to find, and it's very hard to get it right because you never know what time of year it's going to flower. So that was a big challenge, and I'd always wanted to go there because there's a famous photograph of the place where it grows, and it looks like another planet. It looks like solid rock, and all you can see from the top of this mountain is more and more rock. But it's a black and white photograph, and when I actually got there, I found that what looks like rock is in fact green. But anyway, that was a thrill to find that. The other one I'd put on the list is a tiny little thing called the few-flowered fumitory. And I was pleased with that because I actually found it. Most plants, I got other people to find for me and then talk to them about them. But this one, it's an incredibly rare thing, which I don't think many, even botanists, have seen because it grows in cornfields very, very sparsely, and it's hard to identify. And when I found it, it gave me a thrill which I can't possibly describe. But it's a lovely little thing. Once you appreciate its subtle points.
Is that the one where you went? You had 2 passes at it?
No, I think it was only one. I wasn't expecting to find it. That's
right.
Partly
Okay.
it.
Yeah, probably. So you touched on the names and the common names of plants, and I did wonder reading it that as plant hunting becomes rarer and maybe we lose contact with some of these rarer plants, do we also lose some of their common names because they're so descriptive?
Yes.
Are they dying out? And this is a 2-part question really, because I wondered what were some of the most interesting common names that you came across.
The names I like best, all British wildflowers have got English names, but some of them are made-up names, very rare things because only botanists know them. So they're sort of book names. But some of our familiar wildflowers, they've got very old names, and I find them very beautiful. Something like primrose. I mean, isn't that a perfect name for that particular flower? And it comes from the Latin, prima rosa, the first flower. And that gives you primula. You know, all the primulas all over the world that you grow in the garden are all named after the primrose. That means little firstling, the first flower to bloom. You know, there's a lot of these old names: willow herb, snowdrop, cowslip. I particularly like columbine. It's a beautiful name, and it's named after birds. Columbine's named after Columba, which is a dove. And it's because if you look carefully at the flowers of columbine, they look like a lot of little doves all threaded together. The Latin name is aquilegia, which is eagle, and it's named after the little claws at the bottom of the flower. So whoever named our flowers, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, they knew their flowers very well, and they found names that are just perfect for them.
Yeah. Well, that's a stark contrast to some of the cultivars that come out now, and people do decry some really daft names they've been given. So that's really interesting. Thinking of your most triumphant find, in contrast to that, what flower did you most regret not finding?
Well, the one I wanted to find most of all, and I've named the book after it, is the ghost orchid. But the charm of the ghost orchid is it can't be found because it doesn't bother flowering. You know, it exists as a root under the ground, and it only flowers about once every 20 years, if that. So it's only flowered, as far as we know, once since 1985. The frustrating thing is that I'm old enough to have actually seen it when it was flowering more regularly, but I never really bothered. So that was the one I most wanted to see, and if I'd found it, it would have been a different kind of book. But I rather like the idea of not finding it because it haunts the whole book. It turns the quest into an impossibility. You know, not just hard, but impossible.
Yeah.
So it's a ghost in more senses than one.
Yeah, I know. It's you kind of. I think as a reader, you're almost hoping that by the end of it, all of a sudden you happen across it.
Yeah. Well, it's very kind of you to hope that.
Yeah. Eternal optimist. So, thinking of flowers that are scarce, which of those that you saw do you think is most endangered, in your opinion, in its native setting?
Well, I mean, the guessing game about which plant's going to become extinct next is one's always wrong. It always takes you by surprise. But there's two plants in that book. One is the fen ragwort, which is this sort of giant ragwort 7 feet high. And that is now, I gather, the proper wild fen ragwort in Britain is now down to just a single plant. So that's just about as rare as you can get. But they have transplanted seed from it in various places, but they're really gardened. And the other one is the triangular clubrush, which I call the green bayonet, which is nothing much to look at. But that does seem to have gone altogether. The flower, we did find it, but we found one that had been transplanted from the seed of a wild plant. So I don't know whether that counts as properly wild. But that one does seem to have gone, so that might be our next extinct plant. Triangular clubrush.
Right. And I thought that was really interesting what you were saying about the ones that have maybe disappeared from the wild and exist only in almost gardened environments or kind of nature reserves.
Yes.
Does that make them less valid to your quest? Are they no longer able to qualify as wildflowers?
Well, I like to find wild plants in wild places. You know, and if you know that someone has actually planted them from a pot, it takes something out of, you know, that the thing is still surviving genetically as a result. But it's, you know, one isn't really finding a properly wild plant. But in the cases, one or two cases, like the triangular clubrush, it's all that there is left is a planted one. I personally think that conservationists turn to plant pots far too early. They should be thinking more in terms of habitat management. Because sometimes if you manage the habitat right, the plants come back from nowhere. You know, they can last a long time as seed in the soil. And when conditions are right, they'll suddenly come up. So some things that are apparently extinct may actually not be. It may be that they're just sleeping, through this period that's not suitable for them.
And actually thinking back to the triangular club rush, are there any species that are dependent upon that as a food source or anything? I mean, if that goes extinct, will that cause a knock-on effect?
Quite possibly. I don't know whether there's any species that's foolish enough to depend on triangular club rush. I mean, a suicidal choice of life. But some of these rare things do have dependent fungi, some of them, and possibly dependent insects. And of course, they've all got pollen and nectar. They're all feeding butterflies and hoverflies and so on. I think the most serious extinctions would be if something like a tree disappeared. That would take a lot of species with it, even sometimes quite rare trees. But I think these very rare plants, it's probably a sort of insignificant in terms of what their disappearance would mean. Trouble is, I mean, it's our level of knowledge. But what the species that would really matter if they died out are often called keystone species, because if you pull out the keystone, the whole wall falls down. And we don't always know what a keystone species is until it's gone.
Yeah. Out of interest, what are our rarest trees?
Rarest trees? Well, I've got some of them in the book. They're white beams. There are a group of trees which are all rather similar, but they've got different shaped leaves. And they've got white blossom in the spring. They're rather similar to the rowan tree, with white blossom and red berries in the autumn. The difference is, though, that instead of having a divided leaf like the rowan, they have a single leaf which is white underneath because of this felt-like hairs growing on. So when the wind blows, the tree turns from green to white and back again. Very, very pretty. And some of these white beams are not only confined to Britain, found nowhere else in the world, but some of them are found only on a single cliff. So you can actually count the number of plants in the whole world. And in one case, there's only 20. And this is a tree we're talking about, just 20 wild specimens of a tree in the whole world.
I think the white beams might have been some of the more precariously growing species that you mentioned, and I think you did have a few close calls while you were out looking for plants. What was your most dangerous expedition?
We went to the island of Col. It was only dangerous because suddenly I was feeling extremely ill. I mentioned why in the book, but there's a water plant that I'd come all the way to the Outer Hebrides to try and find, and I had to swim underwater to find it. And at that moment, I can swim well enough, but the water was extremely cold. It was a very, very cold day, and I was shivering. And I thought, if I go into that water underneath, I'm going to die. I just was absolutely certain of it at that time. So I never did. I chickened out. Otherwise, I might have drowned.
Yeah.
So that might have been the nearest. I fell off a couple of cliffs, but, that's part of the course.
Oh, God. Has anyone ever come to serious grief plant hunting?
Yeah, I know several botanists that have fallen off cliffs and broken their bones.
Oh, wow.
But I don't know anyone that's actually died for botany. But there were a few in the last century. In the 19th century, there were one or two professional fern collectors that fell off a cliff and were killed.
Wow.
But generally speaking, it's not that risky. The great thing about plants is they stay in one place, and if they're a long way up a cliff, at least you can see them with binoculars. It's not as dangerous as chasing lions,
No, you would hope not. So if anybody was thinking about getting into or even embarking on their own plant hunting quest, can you think of where might be a good place to start?
Yes. There are a lot of wildflowers and 1,000 things it's overwhelming if you try and start from scratch. So I'd recommend specializing in a particular group. Once you know the common wildflowers, the everyday ones around your home, it is good to know the names of those. And often the best thing is to go out with a botany group from the local wildlife trust or something like that. But one suggestion would be that wild orchids have got this particular allure, and that's an easy group to get into, although there are some hard species to identify. But I think orchids are a bit overdone, and I'd suggest a group like maybe ferns or sedges. I mean, they're a lot more subtle than orchids, but they're interesting groups, and the plants have got their own subtle beauty. They often grow in interesting places, and they're not too difficult to name once you sort of understand the differences between one thing and the next. And you won't have to queue up to see your plant as you sometimes do with orchids.
Yeah, that was a really interesting thing that struck me actually reading the book, that it seems as if, is it necessary to strike a balance between getting people interested in our wildflowers and actually limiting the amount of foot traffic to the areas where they grow?
Yes, I think only with orchids. There are one or two very rare orchids where you can get scores of people, all in the same area looking at the same few plants. And there, I suppose, you do have to be careful where you tread, just in case you're treading on the thing you've come to see. But I think, apart from orchids, there aren't enough people looking for plants to cause any particular problems, I don't think. Orchids are the exception.
Okay. And another question that popped up, actually, is when you were searching for plants, did you notice maybe more alien or invasive species as you were going on your travels? Have those increased over the years?
Yes, I'm sure they've increased vastly in my own lifetime. Things like Japanese knotweed or Himalayan balsam, they're vastly more common now than they were 50 years ago. And they're obviously here to stay. But apart from that, the sheer number of naturalized aliens from all around the world are increasing. The flora I got started on has about 2,000 species in, something like that. Well, the very latest flora has now got something closer to 5,000 species. And the difference is all of these new naturalized plants that have escaped from garden centers and places like that. So it provides a lot of interest for people looking for new plants in their particular area, particularly in towns. And only a few of those naturalized species are going to cause problems. Unfortunately, one doesn't necessarily know in advance which are going to be the problematical ones.
Do you have another quest lined up, or have you had quite enough of trotting around, putting yourself in danger?
Well, I'm not really a completist. I've seen all the butterflies and so on without really trying. I did once try to see all the constellations. The star groups in the sky. And one of the reasons I went to New Zealand was to see the constellations you can't see from here. But in terms of the natural world, no, I'll take things as I find them. I think I'm not planning another quest like the last one anytime soon.
No. Well, it did sound as if it took quite a lot out of you, to be fair.
It did in the end, yes.
Yeah.
But still, it gave me a narrative arc.
Yeah.
When something awful happens on a journey like that, if you're actually writing it up, it's a kind of blessing. Every book needs a bit of tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be just one plant after another, wouldn't it? I did try very hard to make it not just one plant after another, but make every plant have its own individuality, and the circumstances are different, and sometimes they involve an adventure, and sometimes adventures are painful.
Yeah, it was great. And you did actually, I think, meet up with some people who were from a slightly younger generation.
Yes.
So I thought perhaps there was some hope for people botanising in the future.
Oh, I'm sure there is. Yes. There will always be some people. Botany is wonderfully instructive because the flowers are all around us. They're making up the whole of our wild scenery. And there are always going to be people that just love plants for their own sake. And I just hope that number will grow, because people are missing a great deal, I think.
Definitely. So if anybody wanted to start the hobby from scratch, so I'm a gardener and I have very tiny knowledge of the plant, the kind of wild plants that are around me. Yeah. So if I wanted to start from scratch, where would be the best place for me to go to get more information?
Well, depending on where you live, I do a bit of internet research about local botany groups, local wildlife groups, people that actually go out and look at wild plants. Probably the obvious place to start would be the local wildlife trust, but they would probably put you on to local botany groups, and there are any number of them all over the country, which are ad hoc groups of people that just meet up and go into the field. So I'd find out whether there are any one of those locally, and go along to one of the meetings and see how you get on. They're always very friendly and welcoming. Botanists are nice people.
Excellent. And if you wanted to have, say, a field guide that was your Bible, what might you get?
There are quite a few now, and it really depends to what extent you really want to get into it. But there are some very nicely illustrated ones. I mean, I don't know whether you want me to mention anyone in particular.
Yes, please. Yes, fine.
Well, I've just pulled one down from my bookcase called Harrop's Wild Flowers, a field guide to the wild flowers of Britain and Ireland. It's called Harrop's because it's by a chap called Simon Harrop. He's a very good photographer, and he's photographed all of the bits of flowers, the whole flower, and also the bits that you need to recognize them by. That's a very nice book. It doesn't have them all in, but it has all the flowers you're most likely to find. Otherwise, the field guides, the Wild Flowers of Britain and Ireland, is illustrated with artwork by the late Marjorie Blamey. She's an absolutely first-rate wildflower artist. The only trouble with most of our field guides is they include European plants as well, largely for commercial reasons. Which is annoying, but there it is. There are more plants than one strictly needs. But there's no shortage of books on the market. The thing to do is go into a good bookshop, have a look around, and take the one that you think would suit you best.
Brilliant.
The one I fell in love with in my teens, long ago, is The Concise British Flora by Peter Marren. I'm not sure it's still in print, but it's very easy to come by secondhand. And as far as I'm concerned, his paintings of flowers are the best ever. They really are a work of art. That's the book I've always used.
Yeah, I've got that knocking around, but it is pretty ancient. It may well just...
Yeah, well, it was 1965, I think, when it came out.
And what was that one that you mentioned that you used almost as a workbook? The really old one.
Oh, the pictures came from. Oh, that was an old Victorian tome. I can't even remember what it's called now, but that's way out of date. But we use those pictures because they're line drawings, and you can reproduce line drawings, on the page with text. I deliberately didn't want to have big coloured pictures of flowers. I wanted to have that slightly ghostly outlines of them. Because anyone reading my book's probably got a field guide anyway.
Is there anything else you wanted to say? Did I miss anything out?
No, except to say, good luck, good hunting, and if anyone's inspired by reading my book or this to actually go out and look for flowers, I'd be absolutely delighted. I think wildflowers have got a subtle beauty that you need to really look at them to appreciate, but it's partly the flowers themselves, and it's partly their setting, the wild places in which they grow. They're an expression of the British landscape. They sort of breathe Britishness. And they've been there for thousands of years, all growing in the same place. And they're ours. It costs nothing to see them. And I think they enrich your lives by looking at them, appreciating them, finding them, and just watching them.
Well, many of us very much have the time at the moment to just watch the plants. There cannot have been a better time to start hunting for wild plants. Many of us are exercising outdoors. The weather's great, the air is clear, and many of our verges and green spaces remain uncut. So do get out there if you can, and maybe you can start your own wild plant quest. Thank you very much to Peter Marren for taking part in the interview. Thanks to you too for listening, and don't forget to check out and support Fertile Fibre, Natural Grower and Garden Topsoil Direct if you can. Stay safe and well, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.